Wishes well doing and welcome back to After They Found Atlantis. Today we're talking about boats and hoes. The hoes will come later. Boats for now. Who were the first to cross the Atlantic? Was it Christopher Columbus or somebody else? Couldn't have been prehistoric people. They didn't have the knowledge. They didn't have the know-how. The prehistoric people were dumb. Let's find out if that's true. Over 10,000 years ago, a mighty fleet set out into the Atlantic Ocean, bringing with it chariots, war horses, slingers, and javelin men. The fleet originated from the island of Atlantis, and its mission was to meet its enemy, those who dwelt within the Pillars of Hercules, and bring them under the rule of the 10 kings of Atlantis. Can we even imagine this to be true? A 10,000-year-old epic ocean battle featuring triremes and war chariots. No, today's academics would say, that is ludicrous. 10,000 years ago, there were no sea voyages across the Atlantic, period, much less epic battles featuring naval ships. Why? Because people then were primitive. But what is the difference between those who lived then and the people that live now? Nothing. They were just as capable of learning as we are today. So why couldn't they have crossed the Atlantic and have naval battles? It's again because they were not capable. Man didn't learn how to cross the Atlantic until much later, thousands of years later in fact, in a slow progression of rafts to canoes to sailboats. This is the conventional academic thinking. A linear progression. On one side of the line, you have the primitive, and on the other, the modern. The modern and us of today. We are the best, with the best technology, the most advanced, and the most knowledgeable. But are we wrong in this view? As long as we have all the isms and the ists in the world today, I think we are leaving out one important one. I call them currentists, and they practice currentism. This is when the people of today think themselves superior of the people of yesterday, and worse, think the people of yesterday incapable of the things of today purely based on the fact that they may have lived in a different far-off time period. If you want to be a currentist, follow one simple criteria. You must abide to a linear history model. Once you do that, then you are automatically a currentist. You are superior. But again, what if you are wrong? We will start with this. History is not strictly linear. It's cyclical, a cycle of rising and falling in many different cycles of time. Humans such as today rose to great heights and then fell back to Earth due to numerous causes, which our world experiences, planet-changing global events, and near extinctions. Mankind 10,000 years ago crossed the Atlantic, and the currentist timeline is leaving out great swaths of human history and accomplishment. But archaeologists might say we haven't found any clue of either of these statements. Here I would say, yes you have, but the evidence is unrecognized. The first clue are the writings attributed to Plato, what are known as dialogues, in particular the dialogues concerning Atlantis. They are the Critias and the Timaeus. Mainstream archaeology is currently under the assumption that the dialogues, even though they feature actual historical figures and make it very clear that Atlantis is actual history and not fictitious, is exactly that, imaginative fiction. And part of what the argument mainstream academia posits is Atlantis can't be real, as it's unfeasible that there could have been triremes in the Atlantic 10,000 years ago. Because according to their linear history, the people of the world at that time were primitive hunters and gatherers who could not voyage between the Americas and Europe. They could only walk, as they did entering the continent across the Bering Land Bridge. But even in this case, archaeologists are wavering and slowly accepting that the primitive hunters and gatherers may have been more. Let's talk about the evolution of the academics' linear timeline for the peopling of the Americas. Beginning in the 1930s, ancient spear points were discovered in North America. The points were often found lodged in the bones of big game mammals such as mammoths. These unique points had certain characteristics, such as having a fluted end and bifacial flint napping. Two sides of the arrowhead were worked instead of just one side, which was the most common around the world. These Clovis points, as they became called, were always discovered deepest in the earth at various archaeological sites, thus making them the oldest, the age 10,900 years. At the same time, the understanding of the origins of the Native Americans became Asia. Plus, there were findings in Brenje that there was once a land bridge into the Americas from Siberia. Also, a period of time was understood to have occurred where an ice-free corridor opened up around 14,000 BC. So it was assumed that the Clovis people followed the big game down into the Americas through the ice-free corridor and hunted all the big game animals out of extinction as they reached South America. This theory was taught in schools for years, even though studies could not be done in Russian Siberia because of the Cold War. What academics expected to find was the Clovis and their points in Siberia. Finally, in the late 1980s, the Cold War ended, and the archaeologists got their chance to study the area, and what they found shocked them, as there was a completely different kind of arrowhead technology there. And to this day, no signs of Clovis points or the Clovis people. Archaeologists were bewildered, except one. His name was Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institute. Dennis Stanford came to the conclusion that the answer to the question of where the Clovis point technology came from was Europe. His theory was based on the fact that the Solutreans had very similar bifacial technology in Iberia, and it spread from there by way of sailing the ice sheets across the Atlantic to the east coast of America, where the largest concentration of Clovis sites exists, not in the west. So that part of the land bridge theory was wrong. In fact, it has been found that all of the theory is wrong. The Clovis aren't even the oldest culture in the Americas. So now, in the last 15 years, some archaeologists are entertaining the idea that perhaps primitive peoples made it to the Americas by way of boat. But there are still those who refuse to think so. They are highlighted here on Wikipedia, tying Dennis Stanford's work to racism, while at the same time practicing Currentism, in my opinion, by discrediting Stanford by saying there's no way primitives could traverse the Atlantic, much less during an ice age. Dennis Stanford died in 2019. He's no longer able to defend his ideas, but he left us with these words.
Now, boats are a pretty good idea, aren't they? They kind of change your perspective of the world because oceans, lakes, rivers, waterways in general no longer are barriers, but they are highways.
One of Stanford's arguments was that the peoples in the Pacific had been finding minuscule islands and sailing for 40,000 years. Also, separately, archaeologists have found that primitive people arrived on the island of Crete 130,000 years ago. Also, the prehistoric sailors of the Cyclades Islands 5,000 years ago constructed a marble pyramid-shaped complex rising out of the sea on the island of Kyros. The marble for the construction was transported from the island of Naxos, which was 7 miles away. 10,000 tons of marble was transported over a 40-year period. Mainstream academics call these builders the prehistoric Aegean project engineers.
Why couldn't these people sail the Atlantic?
The dialogues concerning Atlantis offer us another clue. It tells us Atlantis was an island, and the Atlanteans came from the Atlantic Ocean. And from their island you would find other islands, and from these you would find an opposite continent, all of which was territory of the Empire of Atlantis. So if the primitives, as the mainstream would call them, sailed between the continents, then both continents should share similar historical traits. But do they? Yes, they do. But archaeology explains it away as their favorite catchphrase, independent invention. Look at their linear independent invention timeline. It starts 2.5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, the Paleolithic. Paleo means old and lithic means stone. So it's the Stone Age. All this time on both continents, really everywhere around the world, the people were all hunters and gatherers. Now, after all that time, towards 10,000 years ago, on both separate continents of the Atlantic, people began advancing independently like this. The Solutreans of Europe created biface arrowhead technology and buried caches of their finest works. In the Americas, the Clovis also created biface technology and buried caches of their finest works. Related? No. It was independent invention. Then, the people of Europe and Africa began building pyramids with subterranean cavities in the earth. Across the sea, in the Americas, people also began constructing pyramids with subterranean chambers in the earth. Related? No. Independent invention. The people of Europe and Africa used polygon, pillow-shaped walls and had mysterious knobs on their stones which were locked by metal. Across the sea in the Americas, people also built with pillow-shaped polygon walls with mysterious knobs and locked their stones with metal as well. Related? No way. Independent invention. Now Europe and Africa began mummifying people, some of which had elongated skulls. And in the Americas, they also began mummifying people, some of which had elongated skulls. Was this related? No. Again, it was all independent invention. But wait, there's more. From the years towards 10,000 years ago to now, both the peoples of Europe and Africa and the Americas coincidentally began and mastered archaeoastrology, erecting many different types of structures that could be used as tools to monitor the cycles of time, which included stone circles, wooden circles, earthen mounds, and geoglyphs. These separate peoples on separate continents also independently invented a spiral calendar system that utilized an 18.6-year lunar cycle, along with the ability to track solar alignments such as equinoxes. All of these and more were independently invented with no connection whatsoever. And it's only until Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 that any connection was made. Because all the people before then could not figure it out. I guess you could say the primitive people were dumb.
I want to thank you for watching.